the summer of 1977, a 10-year-old girl in Sydney found the perfect hiding spot. It was so perfect, in fact, that no one has been able to find her for nearly 50 years. Welcome to the Night Crew. Tonight we are going back to a decade that felt simpler on the surface, but held some of the darkest, most lingering secrets in modern history. These stories are meant to be heard as you wind down. So I have paired them with the sound of rain to help you relax and slowly drift off. If you are listening in bed or just need a moment of quiet, I am glad you are here. Feel free to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. I always check them before I head out. Before we start, just a quick reminder to check your front door locks. Then go ahead and gently tap the like button, not because it helps the channel, but because if you do not, it might just be the thing that decides to hide when you are looking for it. Let's get into the first story. The sun over Marrickville on December 22nd was the kind of heat that feels heavy on the skin, a thick Australian summer haze that makes everything move a little slower. Down on the sidewalk near Steele Park, the air smelled like dry grass and exhaust from the passing cars. A single ice cream cone had been dropped on the concrete, and within minutes, it was nothing more than a sticky cream-colored pool reflecting the harsh blue of the sky. In the distance, the muffled sounds of children shouting to each other drifted through the humid air. Helen Karipidis was 10 years old, and like most children in her neighborhood, she lived for these long, sun-drenched afternoons. She was a gentle girl with dark hair and a quiet way of moving through a room that made her seem older than she was. Her family was a fixture in the local Greek-Australian community, a tight-knit circle where everyone knew your name and your parents' names. To Helen, Marrickville was not just a suburb, it was a sprawling backyard where the borders were defined by the houses of aunts and uncles. That December, the Karipidis household was vibrating with the specific kind of energy that only comes right before Christmas. There were boxes of sweets on the counters and the constant hum of festive planning in the background. Helen's mother was busy with the final touches for the holiday meal, and the house was filled with the scent of cinnamon and roasted meat. Helen had been helping where she could, her small hands moving with a careful precision as she organized the decorations, but her mind was already outside, wandering toward the park. Her father, a hard-working man who lived for his children, watched her with a quiet pride as she prepared to head out. He reminded her to stay close and be back before the shadows got too long. In 1977, the idea of a child vanishing from a public park in broad daylight was not something people worried about in Marrickville. It was a place where doors were left unlocked and children moved in packs, protected by the sheer number of eyes always fixed on the street. Helen nodded, gave a quick wave, and stepped out. The neighborhood was a patchwork of brick bungalows and small gardens where the scent of jasmine and grilled lamb often drifted over the fences. Helen walked with a light step, her sandals clicking against the pavement. She passed the local bakery where the owner gave her a small nod, and the corner store where the older men sat on crates talking about the cricket scores. This was her world, a place where the air felt familiar and the streets held no secrets. She reached the edge of Steele Park, the grass yellowed and dry under the relentless sun. Her friends were already there, gathered near a cluster of ancient eucalyptus trees that provided the only real shade in the area. There were 6 of them in total, a mix of boys and girls from the same block who had spent every summer of their lives together. They were loud and energetic, their voices rising over the distant hum of the traffic. They decided on a game of hide-and-seek, a staple of their afternoon routine that never seemed to get old. They drew lots to see who would be the first seeker, their laughter echoing through the park. Helen took her turn as a seeker, first leaning her forehead against the rough, peeling bark of a eucalyptus tree. She closed her eyes and began the slow, rhythmic count to 100, her voice clear and steady. She could hear the frantic scuffle of sneakers on the dry grass and the muffled whispers of her friends as they scrambled for cover. When she reached 100, she turned around and began the hunt. She found them tucked behind the brick restrooms and crouched under the wooden benches, their giggles giving them away. It was a perfect afternoon, the kind that feels like it will never end. The light was starting to turn a deep honey gold, casting long shadows across the playground equipment. They played several rounds, the game growing more competitive as they sought out more creative hiding spots. Helen was enjoying herself, the heat, forgotten in the thrill of the chase. She was a girl who liked the challenge of a good hiding spot, someone who understood that the best place to hide is often right in plain sight. When it finally became Helen's turn to hide, she looked around the park with a playful glint in her eyes. She wanted a spot that would truly stump them, something better than the usual bushes. She saw a line of dense trees and shrubbery near the edge of the park bordering a quiet residential street. It was an area they rarely used, filled with thick undergrowth and deep shadows. With a quick glance back at the seeker, who was only at the number 40, Helen turned and ran toward the shade, her white dress flickering. The child at the tree reached 99, then 100, and shouted the traditional warning for everyone to stay put. One by one, the other children were discovered, popping out from behind the stone walls and the playground slides. They gathered back at the starting tree, wiping sweat from their foreheads and waiting for Helen to emerge. They figured she was just being stubborn, or perhaps she had found a spot so good she was waiting for a formal surrender. They started to call her name, their voices still mostly playful. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The laughter started to die down, replaced by a restless kind of energy. The seeker walked toward the area where Helen had last been seen, pushing through the same bushes and checking behind the same trees, but the space was empty. The other kids joined in, their voices overlapping as they shouted for her to come out. They began to check the perimeter of the park, their pace quickening, as the realization slowly sank in that the park was suddenly unnaturally quiet. The sun dipped lower, and the golden light turned into a deep, bruised purple. The quiet in the park began to feel different. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a summer evening. It was a heavy, expectant silence that seemed to swallow their voices. The children stopped running and stood in a small, tight cluster. One of them decided to run back to the Karipidis' house to see if Helen had simply gotten bored and gone home. The others stayed behind, their eyes fixed on the line of trees where she had vanished. When the friend reached the front door, Helen's father saw the look on the young boy's face and felt the air in his lungs freeze. The boy explained that they could not find her, that she had gone to hide and never came back. Within minutes, the neighborhood was transformed. Neighbors spilled out of their houses with flashlights, their voices calling out for Helen in a desperate rising chorus. They searched the backyards, the garden sheds, and the narrow alleys, but the only response was the distant sound of the city. By the time the police arrived, the park was crawling with people. Officers set up a perimeter, their blue lights flashing against the dark foliage. They moved in a grid shoulder to shoulder, poking through the undergrowth and shining lights into the deep shadows near the river. They expected to find a tripped child or someone hiding out of fear, but as the hours ticked past midnight, the search turned up nothing. No torn fabric, no scuff marks in the dirt, and certainly no sign of the 10-year-old girl in the white dress. The following morning, the scale of the search intensified. Divers entered the murky waters of the nearby Cooks River, their black wetsuits glistening as they disappeared beneath the surface. Search dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to the dry grass, but they seemed confused, circling the area where Helen was last seen before losing the scent entirely. It was as if her trail had simply stopped at the edge of the trees, a clean break in the narrative of her life that no one could explain. In the days following the disappearance, the police investigation began to focus on the terrifyingly small window of time in which Helen had vanished. They interviewed every person who had been in the park that afternoon, reconstructed the game second by second, and mapped out exactly where every child had been standing. What they found was a physical impossibility. Helen had moved from the center of the park to the edge of the trees in a span of less than 45 seconds. In that minute, she had been in the line of sight of several people. Yet not a single witness reported hearing a scream. No one saw a struggle. No one saw a car idling near the curb or a stranger lurking in the bushes. It was as if the ground had simply opened up and pulled her in. The only lead was a vague report of a white van, seen driving slowly near the park perimeter around the time the game started. But in 1977, white vans were as common as the trees themselves. The lead went nowhere, leaving the investigators with a case that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The Karipidis family lived through a nightmare that never ended. For decades, they refused to move from their home in Merrickville. They kept the front door unlocked every single night, a silent invitation for a daughter who was now a ghost in the minds of the public. Her room remained exactly as she had left it on that hot December afternoon, her toys and clothes waiting for a return that felt more distant with every passing year. Her father would often walk to the park at sunset, standing by the same eucalyptus tree. Investigators were haunted by the cold logic of the scene. To take a child in a crowded park without making a sound requires a level of predatory precision that is rarely seen. It suggested someone who had been watching someone who knew the rhythms of the neighborhood and understood exactly when the eyes of the other children would be turned away. The killer did not just take Helen, They took the very idea of safety from the streets of Sydney. The case became a permanent scar on the community, a reminder of a count to 100. There is a specific kind of horror in a case where there is no closure, only a static, unchanging void. For the children who were playing that day, the memory of the game is a weight they have carried into adulthood. They are the last ones to have seen her, the ones who were supposed to find her. They remember the heat, the smell of the grass, and the way the laughter just stopped. They are the ones who have to live with the fact that the person they were looking for was right there, just out of reach, and then she was gone. As of 2026, the Australian authorities have not given up. The New South Wales Police still maintain an active reward of $1 million for any information that leads to the recovery of Helen's remains. Modern investigators are currently using advanced digital mapping to recreate the 1977 layout of Steele Park, trying to identify blind spots that were missed in the original search. They are looking for the one detail, the one person, or the one shadow that finally explains that afternoon. Sometimes the thing that undoes a person isn't the danger itself. It's the moment right before when everything still looked fine. You think you have all the time in the world, that the people you love are just around the corner, waiting to be found. But in the next story, the boundaries of safety are even thinner, and the walls of a school offer no protection from a mystery that was locked from the outside. On the other side of the world, in a city where the sky stays gray for months, a different kind of silence was already waiting. In July of 1975, the sun over Kochi Prefecture did not just shine, it pressed down with a physical, suffocating weight. At Tosa Shimizu High School, the air inside the concrete corridors was stagnant, smelling faintly of floor wax and old paper. High up on the metal fire escape, a single white school shoe sat perfectly upright on a step. It looked abandoned, as if someone had simply stepped out of it and kept walking into the blinding white light of the afternoon sky. The metal of the fire escape was almost too hot to touch, radiating a shimmering haze that distorted the view of the quiet town below. There were no voices nearby, only the relentless vibrating wall of sound from the cicadas in the surrounding cedar trees. The shoe was a standard canvas, uwabaki, the kind every student wore, but here it looked like a jagged error in the landscape. It sat 10 steps below the heavy iron door that led to the school's restricted rooftop. Kiyomi Ohama was the kind of 17-year-old girl who seemed to carry the expectations of her entire community on her shoulders without ever letting them slouch. She was an honors student, a girl who arrived early to organize her desk and stayed late to ensure the student council notes were transcribed in perfect, flowing script. In the small coastal community of Tosa Shimizu, everyone knew her face, and everyone respected the quiet, focused dignity she brought to her life. Her daily life was a series of carefully constructed rhythms that provided a sense of safety to everyone who knew her. She lived with her parents in a modest home where the morning air was often filled with the briny scent of the nearby Pacific Ocean. Every day she would cycle to school, her white blouse crisp despite the humidity, her mind already moving through the day's curriculum. To Kiyomi, the school was not just a building, it was the gateway to a future everyone assumed would be brilliant. That particular July, the school was mostly empty, save for a few students attending summer sessions or specific club activities. Kiyomi had been spending her afternoons in the library, a quiet sanctuary where the heavy wooden shelves acted as a buffer against the heat. She was working on a special research project, her notes spread out across a large oak table under the slow humming ceiling fans. She liked the solitude of the library, the way the dust motes danced in the shafts of light. The pressure of her final year was something she rarely spoke about, but it manifested in the way she meticulously checked every detail of her work. She was carrying the weight of being the top student in her class, a role that required a constant, quiet vigilance. Her parents encouraged her, but they also worried about her lack of rest. They watched her from the kitchen as she studied late into the evening, her silhouette framed by the soft yellow glow of her desk lamp and the dark Shikoku night. On the afternoon of the incident, the humidity had reached a breaking point. Kiyomi had finished her library work early and was seen walking through the hallway toward the main office to return a set of reference books. She looked composed, her footsteps echoing softly on the linoleum. She nodded to a passing teacher, a polite, practiced gesture that was as much a part of her as her name. It was the last time anyone would see her moving with that effortless, organized grace. A young teacher returning to the faculty lounge to escape the heat noticed something unusual as he passed the western wing of the building. The fire exit door at the end of the corridor, which was supposed to remain strictly locked during the summer break, was standing about 2 inches ajar. A thin sliver of blindingly bright daylight was cutting across the dark floor. He paused, his brow furrowing, as he felt a sudden sharp draft of hot air rushing in from the stairwell outside. He walked toward the door, his hand reaching out to grab the heavy metal handle. He expected to find a student playing a prank, or perhaps a maintenance worker who had forgotten to secure the latch. But as he pulled the door open, he saw the empty fire escape stairs. The silence out there was absolute save for the cicadas. He didn't see anyone, but he felt a strange prickle of unease on the back of his neck, a sudden cold sensation that seemed to defy the rising temperature of the afternoon. By 5 in the evening, the routine of the Ohama household began to fracture. Kiyomi's father stood by the front gate, his eyes fixed on the bend in the road where her bicycle usually appeared. The sun was beginning to dip, turning the sky a deep bruised orange, but the street remained empty. He checked his watch every few minutes, his thumb rubbing against the glass. He knew his daughter's schedule better than his own, and she was never even 5 minutes late. When he finally called the school, the principal was the one to answer. He sounded confused at first, explaining that the library had closed an hour ago and that most students had already departed. He promised to do a quick sweep of the grounds, but his voice carried a forced calmness that didn't settle the father's nerves. The principal hung up and looked out at the empty playground, noticing for the first time how long and distorted the shadows of the swings had become in the dying light. The principal walked toward the bicycle racks at the edge of the campus, hoping to find that Kiyomi's bike was gone, which would mean she had simply gone to a friend's house. Instead, he found her bicycle exactly where she always parked it. It was locked securely, the chrome handlebars glinting in the twilight. Her school bag was still strapped to the rear rack, containing her notebooks and the lunchbox her mother had packed that morning. The sight of the abandoned bag made his stomach drop. The local police arrived just as the last of the sun disappeared behind the mountains. They began a room-by-room search of the massive school, building their flashlights, cutting through the dark, cavernous classrooms. The beams bounced off empty chalkboards and neatly stacked chairs. Every door they opened led to more silence. The lead investigator felt the air growing colder as they climbed toward the upper floors, his own breathing sounding unnaturally loud in the hollowed-out space of the hallway. They reached the western wing, following the path the young teacher had described earlier. The investigator stepped out onto the metal fire escape, his boots clanging against the iron. He stopped halfway up his light, landing on the single white shoe. He knelt down, noticing that the laces were still neatly tied. There were no scuff marks on the metal, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had been lifted right out of her footwear by something that didn't leave a trace. The investigator climbed the remaining steps to the rooftop door. He grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. He checked the lock and found it was engaged. This was the central paradox that would define the case. The only keys to this door were kept in a locked cabinet in the principal's office, and the principal had verified they were still there. Yet the door had been found ajar earlier that afternoon, and now it was locked tight from the outside. He called for the principal to bring the keys. When the door finally groaned open, the beam of the flashlight swept across the flat concrete expanse of the roof. In the center of the roof, lying perfectly still under the stars, was Kiyomi. She was positioned with a strange, deliberate neatness, her arms resting at her sides. There was no blood, no robbery, and no obvious sign of how she had been moved to this restricted area. The silence on the roof was heavy and absolute. The autopsy would later reveal that she had been strangled, but the lack of defensive wounds suggested she had been taken completely by surprise. The investigation quickly turned into a puzzle of logistics. The rooftop was a restricted zone surrounded by a high fence that showed no signs of being climbed. The only way on or off the roof was through the door they had just unlocked. If the killer had exited through that door, they would have needed a key to lock it behind them. The police questioned every staff member, focused on the possibility of an insider. They checked the alibi of the principal, the teachers, and even the janitors. Everyone had a place they were supposed to be, and no one could explain how a killer could move a 17-year-old girl through a school building in broad daylight without being seen. The theory of the locked room began to circulate through the town, turning the school into a place of whispered ghost stories and dark legends. During the questioning, A witness from a nearby construction site mentioned seeing a man in a light blue uniform lurking near the fire escape around 3 in the afternoon. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it was a maintenance worker or a technician. But when the police checked the school's records, no maintenance had been scheduled for that day. The man in blue became a phantom, a figure who seemed to have the ability to walk through locked doors and vanish into the heat haze. The twist came when a forensic locksmith examined the rooftop door. He discovered that while the lock was high quality, the strike plate was slightly misaligned. If someone knew exactly where to apply pressure, they could pull the door shut in a way that would cause the bolt to slip into place without using a key. It was a detail that only someone intimately familiar with the building's flaws would know. The killer hadn't needed a key. They had used the building's own mechanical failures against it. You are standing on that roof now, the concrete still holding the day's heat against the soles of your feet. Below you, the lights of the town are beginning to flicker on, and you can hear the distant sound of a car engine or a dog barking. To anyone looking up, the roof looks empty, a silent slab of gray against the night sky. But in the space where you stand, the air feels thin and charged with a desperate hidden pressure. You realize how easy it is to be entirely alone, even when the rest of the world is only a few flights of stairs away. The climax of the investigation was a frantic search for the man in the blue uniform, but by the time the police realized the significance of the door's flaw, the trail had gone cold. The man had simply evaporated. The investigation lingered for years, a weight that pulled at the heart of Tosa Shimizu. Kiyomi's father continued to cycle past the school every morning, his eyes always drifting up toward the western wing, looking for a shadow that was no longer there. The truth of what happened that afternoon remains a collection of fragments. The reconstruction suggests the killer had been watching Kiyomi for weeks, learning her library routine and her habit of walking alone through the western wing. He had accessed the roof earlier, prepared the door, and waited in the silence. When she passed by, he had only a few seconds to act, pulling her into the stairwell and toward the roof in a move so swift and silent that it left the rest of the school undisturbed. The killer was likely a temporary contractor, or someone who had worked on the building's construction years prior, providing them with the knowledge of the door's mechanical quirk. They were someone who moved through the world unnoticed, a person whose presence was so mundane that it served as a perfect disguise. They didn't just kill Kiyomi. They committed a crime that relied on the very architecture of her safe haven, turning her place of learning into a meticulously prepared trap. As of 2026, the case has seen a sudden surge of renewed interest. In 2024, a group of dedicated alumni established a fund to hire private investigators who specialize in cold cases. They are currently utilizing modern 3D scene reconstruction technology to map every inch of the school as it existed in 1975. They are looking for the blind spots in the hallways, trying to prove exactly where the man in the blue uniform could have hidden while the world went on just a few feet away. The weight of a school shoe left behind on a staircase is a quiet kind of grief, a reminder of a life that was paused in the middle of a step. It is the feeling of a door being locked from the outside when you thought you were the only one with the key. Sometimes the objects we leave behind tell the story better than we ever could. A shoe on a step, or perhaps on the other side of the world, a heavy brown suitcase found bobbing in the gray, choppy waters of a Swedish lake. The gray, choppy waters of Lake Albigeon lapped against the reeds with a rhythmic, wet, slapping sound that seemed to swallow the afternoon silence. A fisherman stood on the shore, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, dark mud of the bank as he adjusted his line. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sharp, metallic tang of the lake water. About 20 feet out, a dark, rectangular shape was bobbing slowly in the current, looking at first like a piece of discarded timber or a piece of old luggage. He watched it for a long time, the way it sat low in the water, indicating it was heavy with something more than just air. It was a large brown suitcase, the old-fashioned leather kind with brass latches that caught the weak Swedish sunlight. As the wind shifted, a faint, sickly sweet odor drifted toward him, something that made the hair on his arms stand up. He didn't want to go into the water, but the sight of that suitcase, so out of place in the wilderness, began to exert a strange magnetic pull on his curiosity. In the summer of 1976, the city of Gothenburg felt like a place where nothing truly terrible could happen. It was the era of the Swedish social project, a time when trust was the primary currency, and children moved through the world with an independence that seems impossible today. Neighbors looked out for one another, and the courtyards of the apartment complexes were treated like shared living rooms. The sun stayed high in the sky until late in the evening, casting a soft, eternal glow over the brick buildings and the well-kept gardens. Kerstin Blom was 5 years old, a girl with bright, inquisitive eyes and hair, the color of ripened wheat. She was the kind of child who noticed the small things, a beetle crawling across a leaf, the way the shadows moved on the wall of her bedroom. Her world was a safe, predictable circle of family toys and the courtyard outside her home in the Hisingen district. On that particular July afternoon, the air was warm and still filled with the sound of distant traffic and the chirping of birds in the nearby trees. Her mother was in the kitchen, the window open to catch the slight breeze, and she could hear the rhythmic sound of Kerstin's shoes hitting the pavement outside. It was a comforting, familiar sound that anchored the afternoon. Kerstin was playing with a ball, tossing it against the wall, and catching it, a simple game that she could play for hours. The courtyard was enclosed a private sanctuary, where the only visitors were the people who lived in the surrounding flats. There was no reason to worry, no reason to suspect that the boundaries of that sanctuary were porous. The Swedish concept of the people's home was at its peak during this decade, creating a society where the collective welfare was paramount. People rarely locked their doors during the day, and the idea of a predator lurking in a suburban courtyard was something that belonged in a dark fairy tale, not in modern Gothenburg. This absolute trust was the very thing that made the community vulnerable. It was a quiet, stable world, where the worst thing that usually happened was a bicycle being moved or a garden hose left running. Kerstin's mother turned away from the window to check the stove, the scent of baking bread filling the small apartment. She was only gone for a minute, perhaps two. When she returned to the window to call Kerstin in for a snack, the courtyard was silent. The ball she had been playing with was sitting perfectly still in the middle of the pavement, but the girl was nowhere to be seen. The mother leaned out, her voice calling Kerstin's name, expecting to see her pop out from behind a bush or the corner of the building. The silence that followed her call was heavy and unresponsive. She stepped out onto the balcony, her eyes scanning the area with a rising sense of confusion. The courtyard was small enough that there were only so many places a 5-year-old could hide. She went downstairs, her footsteps sounding loud and frantic against the stairs. She walked the perimeter of the building, checking the laundry room and the storage lockers, her heart beginning to thud against her ribs with a slow, deliberate rhythm that she could feel in her throat. She asked a neighbor who was hanging laundry if they had seen Kerstin, but the woman only shook her head, her face clouding with a sudden mirrored concern. They checked the street, but the sidewalks were empty under the baking sun. There were no strange cars, no shouting, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the girl had simply evaporated into the humid air. By the time the police were called, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, their faces pale as they realized the impossible had happened in their own backyard. The search that followed was one of the largest in Swedish history. Thousands of volunteers joined the police, moving in long lines through the woods and the parks, their voices calling out for Kerstin until they were hoarse. Divers went into the canals and helicopters hovered over the city, their searchlights cutting through the short northern nights. The national media picked up the story, and soon the image of the little girl with the wheat-colored hair was on every television screen in the country. As the days passed without a single lead, a dark cloud of suspicion began to settle over the city. People started looking at their neighbors differently, wondering if the person they shared a laundry room with was hiding a terrible secret. The police questioned everyone in the apartment complex, checking alibis and searching basements, but they found nothing. There were no witnesses who saw Kerstin leave the courtyard, and no one could explain how a child could vanish from a secure area in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. 1 week after the disappearance, the fisherman at Lake Albishun finally decided to row his small wooden boat out to the bobbing Suitcase. The water was still reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. As he pulled alongside the object, the smell became overwhelming, a thick, cloying stench that seemed to coat the back of his tongue. He reached out with a gaff, hooking the leather handle and pulling the suitcase toward the boat. It was incredibly heavy, the water streaming out of the seams in dark, muddy rivulets. He hauled it onto the deck, the boat rocking precariously under the sudden weight. The brass latches were corroded but still held firm. With trembling fingers, he flicked the locks open. Inside, he didn't find clothes or travel gear. He found a floral-patterned carpet folded over several times. When he peeled back the edge of the fabric, he saw a shock of blonde hair and a small, pale hand. He sat back in the boat, the oars clattering against the wood as the silence of the lake suddenly felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. The discovery sent a shockwave through the country. The autopsy revealed that Kerstin had been kept alive for several days before she was killed. This detail was the most haunting part of the case. It meant the killer had been living with her, perhaps only a few miles from where her parents were waiting for her to come home. The floral carpet and the brown suitcase were processed for evidence, but in 1976, the tools of forensic science were limited. They found a few strands of hair and some fibers, but nothing that could point to a specific person. The lead detective on the case was a man who took the loss personally. He kept the suitcase in a storage locker in his office, and every day for the next 25 years he looked at it. He studied the floral pattern of the carpet and the way the leather had worn on the corners of the bag. He interviewed hundreds of suspects, including a local man named Flink who had a history of petty crime, but there was never enough evidence to make an arrest. The case went cold, becoming a permanent, painful mystery in the Gothenburg archives. You are standing in that storage room now, the air smelling of old paper and stale dust. The suitcase sits on a metal shelf, its brown leather cracked and faded. You can feel the weight of all those years of silence pressing in on you. The detective is sitting at his desk, his hair now gray, looking at a file that has grown thick with dead ends and failed leads. You realize that justice isn't always a fast-moving machine. Sometimes it is just a man in a quiet room who refuses to forget a name. By the time the year 2001 arrived, the world of forensics had undergone a total revolution. DNA profiling and advanced fingerprint recovery were now standard. The detective, now nearing retirement, decided to send the contents of the suitcase to the National Lab one last time. He focused on a small detail that had always bothered him. The suitcase had been lined with old newspapers to keep the carpet from shifting. He hoped that somewhere on that newsprint, the killer had left a part of himself behind. The technicians at the lab used a new chemical process that could lift prints from porous surfaces even decades after the fact. They spent weeks meticulously treating every page of the 1976 newspapers. On a page from the sports section, they found a single clear thumbprint. It was a partial mark, but it was enough to run through the national database. When the computer finally chirped with a match, the name that appeared on the screen was one the detective had seen many times before Flink. The investigation into Flink's life revealed a man who had lived in total obscurity. He had worked a series of low-level jobs and had never married. He lived in a small apartment not far from the Hisingen district, a place filled with stacks of old newspapers and cheap furniture. Neighbors described him as a ghost of a man, someone who moved through the hallways without making eye contact. He had been a predator hiding in plain sight, protected by the very anonymity of the urban landscape he inhabited. When the police arrived at his door to make the arrest, they found the apartment empty. Flink had died of natural causes just a few months earlier, taking his final secrets with him. They searched the premises and found a storage unit that contained more floral carpets and several other suitcases. It became clear that Kerstin might not have been his only victim, though she was the only one they could definitively link to him. The justice that arrived was cold and silent, a closure that came too late for a trial but just in time to clear a detective's conscience. The reconstruction of the crime showed that Flink had simply walked into the courtyard that afternoon using his nondescript appearance to blend in. He had likely enticed Kerstin with a small toy or a kind word, and she, raised in a world of absolute trust, had followed him out the gate. He kept her in his apartment for 3 days, a period of time that remains a blank, terrifying space in the narrative. Then he had wrapped her in the carpet, packed her into the suitcase, and driven out to the lake under the cover of darkness. Flink was a man who understood the power of being overlooked. He didn't have a high-tech hideout or a complex plan. He simply relied on the fact that people don't look closely at the mundane. He was the man who held the door for you, the one who sat on the bus and stared out the window. His ability to remain calm while living with the evidence of his crime for 25 years suggested a terrifying lack of empathy, a psychological void that allowed him to outlast the very investigation meant to catch him. As of 2026, the memory of Kerstin Blom remains a powerful force in Gothenburg. Her grave is located in a quiet corner of the local cemetery, and it is almost never without fresh flowers. People who were children themselves in 1976 often visit leaving white roses as a tribute to the girl who changed the way Sweden looked at its own safety. The suitcase and the floral carpet are now part of a permanent police museum exhibit, serving as a reminder of the persistence of the human spirit in the face of absolute darkness. The Swedish legal system used the Kerstin Blom case as a primary driver for updating how evidence is preserved in cold cases. Because that detective refused to throw away a moldy suitcase, a killer was eventually named. It proved that time does not always erase the truth. Sometimes it just buries it deep enough that you have to wait for the world to catch up. The case stands as a testament to the idea that no one is truly forgotten as long as someone is still looking for them in the silence. That was 1976. 6 years later, in a different part of Europe, the safety of a government-run institution would prove to be just as fragile as a suburban courtyard. A different kind of shadow was waiting at a rural bus stop in the Burgundy forest, watching for the vulnerable. In the next case, the danger didn't come from a stranger in a suitcase. It came from a man who was paid to make sure the children got home safely. The sharp hiss of air brakes echoed through the damp Burgundy forest as the small school bus pulled over at an empty crossroads. It was late autumn 1975, and the twilight was already beginning to turn the trees into jagged black silhouettes against the cold gray sky. The bus door folded open with a mechanical groan, revealing the flickering orange glow of the interior lights, but no one stepped out onto the gravel. The driver sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the wheel, watching the empty road ahead. Inside the bus, the air was warm and smelled of damp coats and cigarette smoke. The driver, a man named Émile Louis, was a constant, dependable fixture in the lives of the young women he transported every day. He was the regular driver for the Association for the Paralyzed and Disabled care home in the Yonne region. To the residents, Louis was a man of routine and quiet authority, someone who ensured they reached their vocational training centers and returned safely to their beds. These women, mostly in their late teens or early 20s, were often wards of the state with mild intellectual disabilities. They lived in a world of rigid schedules and supervised activities where the bus ride was their primary connection to the outside world. They trusted the driver because they were taught to trust the uniform and the routine that kept their lives organized. For them, the yellow bus was a symbol of independence, a way to move through a landscape that often felt closed off. The care home in Auxerre was a place of fading wallpaper and long linoleum-lined hallways that amplified the sound of every footstep. Life there was predictable, governed by the ringing of bells and the distribution of meals in the communal dining hall. For many of the residents who had no families to visit them, the staff and the other girls were their entire world. They relied on the system to provide the protection and the sense of belonging they could not always find for themselves. Émile Louis was more than just a driver to them. He was a friendly face who knew their names and their quirks. He would sometimes offer a small candy or a kind word as they boarded the bus, gestures that meant everything to young women who were often starved for individual attention. He was a man who seemed to take pride in his work, arriving exactly on time every morning to ferry his passengers through the rolling vineyard-covered hills of the Auxerre countryside. One of the girls, a gentle young woman named Marie-Jeanne, always sat in the front seat near the door. She liked to watch the way the driver handled the heavy steering wheel and the way he checked the mirrors with a slow, deliberate rhythm. She felt a sense of belonging in that bus, a feeling that she was part of a movement that mattered. The driver would occasionally make small talk about the weather or the local crops, and Marie-Jeanne would listen with a quiet, attentive smile. The landscape of the Yonne region was beautiful but desolate, filled with deep forests and isolated farmsteads that seemed to watch the road with indifferent eyes. In the 1970s, the roads were often empty, and the silence of the countryside was absolute. For the girls on the bus, the world outside the windows was a blur of green and brown, a place that felt safe as long as they were inside, the warm humming cabin of the vehicle, and under the watchful eye of their regular driver. At the care home, the staff viewed Louis as a model employee, a man who never complained about the difficult hours or the specific needs of his passengers. He was a family man, a father who lived in a modest home and seemed to embody the hard-working values of the French working class. No one questioned his background or the way he interacted with the girls when the bus was out of sight. In a small town like Auxerre, a man with a steady job and a quiet demeanor was above suspicion. The pressure of living in state care was a constant weight for the residents who were always aware of their own vulnerability. They knew they were different from the people in the town, and they clung to the structures that gave them a sense of normalcy. The bus was their chariot, a piece of the world that belonged to them. They didn't see the driver as a stranger. They saw him as an extension of the home itself, a protector who stood between them and the vast unknown world. As the months passed, the bond between the driver and his regular passengers grew stronger. He knew which girls liked to sit by the window and which ones were afraid of the dark. He tailored his small acts of kindness to their specific needs, creating a psychological space where they felt seen and valued. This grooming was so subtle that it was invisible even to the girls themselves. They didn't see the way he was cataloging their weaknesses. They only felt the warmth of his feigned interest. In the late afternoons, when the sun was low and the shadows were long, the bus would often be the only vehicle on the rural lanes. The girls would be tired from their day of training, leaning their heads against the vibrating glass of the windows as the bus wound its way through the forest. The atmosphere was one of quiet exhaustion and the comfort of returning home. They had no reason to believe that the path they traveled every day could ever lead anywhere other than the front gates of the home. The care home staff noticed that some of the girls seemed more anxious than usual, but they attributed it to the changing of the seasons or the inherent difficulties of their conditions. They didn't look closer at the bus driver's schedule or the occasional delays in his arrival times. In their eyes, the system was working as it should, providing a necessary service to a population that was often ignored by the rest of society. The silence of the Burgundy woods remained undisturbed. One evening in 1975, a young woman named Françoise was marked as present on the bus, manifest for the ride back to the home. She had been seen boarding the vehicle at the training center, her small bag clutched in her lap. But when the residents gathered for the evening meal, her chair remained empty. The staff checked the laundry room and the garden, their confusion slowly turning into a dull, nagging worry as they realized she wasn't hiding in any of the usual places. The care home director called the local gendarmerie to report the disappearance, but the response was a weary shrug of the shoulders. The officials stated that young women with disabilities often ran away to find a life they couldn't have in state care, and they assumed Françoise had simply caught a train to Paris. They closed the file before the investigation had even begun, choosing to believe a convenient lie rather than investigate a difficult truth that might disturb the local peace. Over the next 2 years, the pattern repeated itself with a sickening regularity. 6 more young women, all from the same care network and all using the same bus route, vanished into the Burgundy mist. Each time the reports were met with the same cold indifference from the judicial system. The girls were orphans, they were marginalized, and in the eyes of the Auxerre bureaucracy, their absence was merely a reduction in paperwork rather than a human tragedy that required justice. A lone gendarme named Pierre Charrier sat in his small office surrounded by the growing stack of missing person reports that no one else wanted to touch. He was a man who believed that the law should be a shield for the weak, not a rug to hide them under. As he looked at the names of the 7 disappeared women, he began to draw lines between them on a map. Every single girl had one common denominator that could not be ignored. They were last seen boarding a bus driven by Émile Louis. Charrier spent his nights reviewing the bus routes and the timing of the disappearances. He noticed that each girl had vanished on a day when the bus had been delayed by a supposed mechanical issue or a road closure. He began to track Louis's movements, finding that the driver often spent his weekends deep in the forest, claiming to be hunting or foraging for mushrooms. The gendarme felt a rising sense of dread as he realized the killer wasn't a stranger. He was the person the state paid to protect them. When Charrier presented his findings to his superiors, he was met with a wall of silence. He was told to drop the case and stop harassing a respectable local employee. The local elite did not want a scandal that would expose the failures of the social welfare system, and Louis was a man who knew how to make himself useful to the right people. Realizing the files were at risk of being destroyed, Charrier secretly copied every document and hid them in a wooden crate in his own attic. For 20 years, the silence in the Yonne region held firm. The girls were forgotten by the world, their names fading from the public consciousness, but Charrier kept his crate, waiting for the political winds to shift. The twist was not just that a killer was loose, but that the entire legal and social structure of Auxerre had knowingly allowed him to remain free to protect their own reputations. The safety of the government bus had been a lethal lie maintained by the very people in charge. The climax arrived in the year 2000, when a persistent journalist and a retired Charrier finally forced a new investigation into the cold files. Émile Louis, now an old man living in retirement, was brought in for questioning. Under the weight of the evidence Cherrier had saved in his attic, the driver's composure finally fractured. He admitted to the crimes, leading the police deep into the Burgundy forest and pointing to the damp, moss-covered ground where he had buried the young women. The reconstruction of the crimes was a haunting revelation of the driver's method. He would alter his route, claiming a road was closed or that he needed to make a quick stop. He would drive the bus to a desolate spot he had scouted beforehand, knowing no one would come looking for girls the system had already discarded. He used his position of authority to manipulate their trust, turning a government-funded vehicle into a mobile trap from which there was no possible escape for his victims. He did not just drive a bus. He treated the geography of the Yonne region as a private hunting map. He knew every blind curve, every hidden logging trail, and every abandoned quarry where a vehicle could sit unobserved for hours. He was a man who understood that his greatest protection wasn't his innocence, but the fact that the victims he chose were people the world had decided were not worth the effort of finding. He relied on the indifference of others as his primary shield. As of 2026, the case of the disappeared of Lyon remains one of the darkest stains on French judicial history. New excavations are currently being planned in the forests near Auxerre, as modern investigators believe Louis may have been responsible for dozens more disappearances that were never officially recorded. The case is now a mandatory study in French law schools, serving as a definitive example of the catastrophic collapse of a state's duty to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The safety of a state-run bus turned out to be a hollow promise, a cage on wheels with a driver who held all the keys. Sometimes the most dangerous place in the world is the one where you are supposed to be seen but are actually invisible. The tragedy is that the girls were never lost. They were just hidden in plain sight by a system that didn't want to look. In the next case, that invisibility takes a different form, not as a passenger on a bus, but as a nameless girl in a rice sack floating through the crowded, indifferent canals of Hong Kong. The air in Tuen Moon in May of 1976 felt less like atmosphere and more like a warm, wet blanket. It carried the heavy scent of stagnant water and the sharp metallic tang of nearby high-rise construction. Down in the drainage canal, a tattered rice sack had snagged on the skeletal frame of a submerged shopping cart. It bobbed lazily in the sluggish current, its plastic fibers fraying under the relentless Hong Kong sun. Above the canal, the new territories were a chaotic symphony of rapid growth. Scaffolding made of bamboo climbed the sides of new apartment blocks like skeletal vines, and the sound of jackhammers provided a constant jarring rhythm to the day. For a schoolgirl in 1976, this was a world of transition. She would have walked these dusty streets in a crisp white cotton uniform, her hair tied back in a neat ponytail that swayed with each determined step toward the bus stop. Life in these crowded districts was a delicate balance of tradition and survival. Many families had arrived only recently, living in the shadow of the tall buildings and working long hours in the nearby textile factories. A 17-year-old girl would have been the bridge between two worlds, translating for her parents while she studied for exams that promised a way out. She would have known the shortcut through the industrial lots and the quickest way to cross the canal when the rains turned the paths to mud. Her daily routine was defined by the clatter of the tram and the heavy, humid heat of the afternoons. She likely spent her hours after school in a small shared apartment, the air filled with the smell of frying ginger and the sound of a neighbor's radio. There was a quiet pressure to succeed, to be the first in the family to earn a degree. She carried her books in a canvas bag, her fingers often stained with ink from a day of taking meticulous notes in a crowded, unventilated classroom. The new territories felt like a place where you could easily get lost in the sheer volume of people, but there was a collective vigilance that kept the community together. Mothers watched from balconies, and street vendors knew which students were late for their morning commute. It was a landscape of thousands of eyes, all focused on the daily grind of building a life in a city that never seemed to stop growing. No one expected a person to simply vanish from such a vibrant, crowded tapestry. She would have walked past the canal every day, a place where the city's waste gathered before being flushed out to sea. To her, it was just part of the scenery, a dull gray vein running through the heart of the district. She had plans for the weekend, perhaps a trip to the cinema or a walk through the market with her friends. Her future was a series of small, manageable goals, all leading toward a life that felt more permanent than the bamboo scaffolding that surrounded her. A sanitation worker moved along the edge of the canal, his long bamboo pole reaching out to clear the debris that threatened to block the drainage pipe. He worked with a slow, practiced efficiency, ignoring the heat and the persistent smell of the water. He pushed aside a floating crate and a clump of weeds, his eyes settling on the large rice sack caught on the shopping cart. It looked heavier than the usual trash, sitting deep in the water like it was filled with wet sand. He hooked the edge of the plastic and tried to pull it toward the bank, but the weight of it was surprising. The sack didn't give way like empty packaging. It moved with a dense, sluggish resistance that strained his forearms. He felt the fibers of the sack begin to tear under the pressure, revealing a glimpse of something white and smooth tucked inside. He paused his breath, catching as he realized the shape within the sack was far too structured to be industrial waste or kitchen scraps. The police arrived as the midday heat reached its peak. They hauled the sack onto the concrete embankment, the water draining out of it in long, dark streaks. When the lead investigator cut through the heavy twine at the top, the plastic peeled back to reveal the body of a young girl. She looked as though she were merely sleeping, her eyes wide open and staring up at the bright Hong Kong sky. She was still wearing her school uniform, the white fabric now stained gray by the murky canal water. The investigator began a systematic search for any form of identification. He checked the pockets of her blouse and looked for a school badge or a name tag sewn into the collar. He found nothing. He moved to the canvas bag found near the body, hoping for a notebook or a library card that would give her a name. But the bag was empty, and every single page of her textbooks had been neatly ripped out. There was not a single scrap of paper to tell them who she was. Officers were dispatched to every secondary school in the new territories carrying a photograph of the girl's face. They moved through the classrooms showing the image to teachers and students, waiting for the gasp of recognition or the sudden tearful identification. But as the days turned into a week, the response was a consistent, haunting silence. No one knew her. No one recognized the quiet, beautiful face in the photograph, and no one had reported a student missing. The pressure inside the police headquarters began to mount as the realization set in that they were looking for a ghost. They checked the immigration records and the refugee camps, thinking she might have arrived recently from the mainland. They looked for families who had suddenly moved away, or shops that had closed their doors without explanation. But the city of millions remained indifferent. It was as if she had been born into the world and then erased from its records in a single coordinated act. The forensic report provided the clue that changed everything. The pathologist discovered that every single clothing tag had been surgically removed with a razor. Her jewelry was gone and her fingernails had been clipped down to the quick. Most chillingly, her fingertips had been lightly treated with a concentrated acid, just enough to blur the ridges of her prints without causing deep scarring. The killer had not just taken her life. They had performed a professional audit of her identity, removing every possible anchor to the physical world. The detective stood by the canal looking at the spot where the sack had been found. He realized the killer wasn't a panicked amateur. They were someone who treated murder like a clerical error that needed to be corrected. This was a person who understood the power of anonymity in a city of migrants. By choosing a girl who was likely part of an undocumented family, they had ensured that even her death would remain a secret. The killer hadn't just hidden a body, they had hidden a human existence. The reconstruction of the crime suggested the girl had been intercepted on her way home, lured into a vehicle by someone she likely recognized as a figure of authority. She was strangled quickly and quietly, her body then prepared in a sterile environment where her identity could be systematically dismantled. The killer had likely spent hours removing the tags and treating her skin, working with a cold, detached precision before packing her into a common rice sack and letting the canal currents do the rest of his work. The perpetrator was someone who thrived on the meticulous nature of the task. They were likely a person whose daily life involved logistics or administration, someone who valued order above all else. They didn't leave a calling card or a signature. They left a blank space where a person used to be. Their greatest weapon was the realization that in a city as crowded as Hong Kong, the easiest way to hide a crime is to make the victim belong to no one. As of 2026, the girl in the sack remains one of Hong Kong's most enduring cold cases. In 2025, however, a new lead emerged when police utilized AI facial reconstruction technology to create a hyper-realistic image of the victim. The image went viral on social media, leading to 3 potential family matches currently undergoing DNA testing. For the first time in 50 years, there is a chance the girl in the white uniform might finally be given back the name that was stolen from her. A tattered rice sack snagged on a metal frame. That's all it was. In the next case, the threat would come in a much more festive package, a bright red box of expensive chocolates left as a gift for a city that was about to find out how quickly sweetness can turn to poison. The air in Tokyo in January of 1977 was brittle and dry, the kind of cold that seems to vibrate in the back of the throat with every breath. At the entrance of the Ginza subway station, the concrete steps were swept clean, and the rhythmic sound of thousands of leather shoes clicking against the tile floor created a steady, industrial hum. A small, bright red box sat on a wooden bench, its festive wrapping untouched, glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal. Hiroshi was a 34-year-old salaryman who lived his life by the precise ticking of a silver wristwatch. Every morning he performed a series of movements, so practiced they felt like a ritual. The tightening of his tie, the brief nod to his wife over a bowl of miso soup, and the walk to the station where the train arrived at exactly 8:03. He was a man who valued the predictable nature of his world, a world where everyone followed the rules and the city functioned like a giant, well-oiled machine. In 1977, Tokyo was a city caught in the middle of a massive economic surge, a place of neon lights and soaring steel that still held onto the quiet traditions of the past. There was a deep, unspoken trust that existed between strangers. It was common to see a person leave their bag on a seat to save it, or for a lost wallet to be returned with every yen still inside. To Hiroshi, this social contract was the foundation of his safety, a silent agreement that made the dense crowds feel manageable. Hiroshi worked in the accounting department of a mid-sized firm, a job that required a high level of focus and a tolerance for repetitive tasks. He spent his days surrounded by the soft clatter of adding machines and the smell of fresh ink. He was a man who didn't mind the quiet. He found comfort in the rows of numbers that always added up a stark contrast to the chaotic growth of the city outside his office window. He was a small part of a big system, and he was perfectly fine with that. His evenings were spent in a small apartment in the suburbs, where the sounds of the city were replaced by the muffled noise of the television and the clink of ceramic dishes. He and his wife were saving for a new car, and they often spent their nights looking through glossy catalogs, debating the merits of different colors and models. It was a life of modest goals and steady progress, a life that felt shielded from the darker edges of the world that occasionally flickered on the nightly news. During the New Year season, the culture of gifting in Japan reached its peak. It was the time of Osebo, where people exchanged elaborately wrapped boxes of food and candy to show gratitude to colleagues and neighbors. The department stores were filled with vibrant displays of chocolates, dried fruits, and tea, all packaged with a level of artistry that made the contents seem almost secondary. Gifting was not just a gesture, it was a social obligation that everyone participated in with a sense of duty. Hiroshi carried this sense of obligation with him as he navigated the crowded station platforms. He noticed the abandoned boxes and bags left on benches, usually the result of a tired commuter forgetting their purchase in the rush to catch a train. In a city of millions, these lost items were a daily occurrence. You would see a box of expensive crackers or a tin of premium coffee sitting alone, and you would simply walk past, assuming the owner would return or the station staff would eventually collect it. On a Tuesday afternoon, Hiroshi was standing on the platform at Tokyo Station waiting for his transfer. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool coats and the ozone from the electric tracks. He looked down and saw a box of chocolates sitting on a ledge near the vending machines. It was wrapped in heavy gold-flecked paper with a silk ribbon tied in a perfect bow. There was a small handwritten note tucked under the ribbon that read, "A gift to the people of Tokyo." He felt a brief moment of curiosity, wondering who would leave such an expensive item behind on purpose. In the back of his mind, he remembered the headlines from a few months prior, the strange stories of bottles of cola being found with their caps slightly loose. But those incidents felt like a distant, isolated problem, something that happened in a different part of the city to different kinds of people. He boarded his train and forgot about the gold box as the doors slid shut with a pneumatic hiss. The first offbeat detail didn't come from Hiroshi, but from a station attendant named Sato. Sato was emptying the trash bins near the ticket gates when he found a discarded chocolate box that appeared to be full. He He opened it expecting to find a spoiled batch of candy, but the chocolates looked perfect, shimmering like dark jewels in their plastic trays. What caught his eye, however, was a faint white dusting on the bottom of the box, a fine powder that looked like powdered sugar but lacked its sweet scent. Within 48 hours, the pressure began to rise across the entire metropolitan area. Reports started filtering in from different wards about citizens who had found boxes of candy in public parks, on subway benches, and even in their own mailboxes. The notes were always the same, written in a polite, formal hand that thanked the public for their hard work. It was a message that resonated with the weary commuters, making the gifts seem like a genuine act of anonymous charity in a cold winter. A college student in Shinjuku was the first to experience the discovery. He had found a box of chocolates on a park bench and decided to share them with his classmates. He broke off a piece of a dark truffle and placed it on his tongue. For a split second, he tasted the rich, bitter cocoa and the creamy center. Then a sharp chemical burn ignited in the back of his throat. It was a sensation like swallowing a hot coal, followed instantly by a strange almond-like bitterness that coated his entire mouth. The reaction was nearly instantaneous. His chest tightened, as if a heavy iron band were being cinched around his ribs, and his breath became a series of shallow, desperate gasps. He tried to speak, but his tongue felt thick and unresponsive, a dead weight in a mouth that was suddenly parched. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, and his vision began to blur into a series of jagged, vibrating shapes. He reached for the table to steady himself, but his muscles refused to obey, leaving him to collapse. The investigation was launched with a massive mobilization of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. They realized they weren't dealing with a simple case of food spoilage. They were hunting a killer who used the city's own politeness as a delivery system. Every station attendant was ordered to clear every bench, and the public was warned through loudspeakers to never touch any unattended items. The candy was sent to the crime labs where technicians worked behind glass shields, their faces grim as the tests confirmed their worst fears. The chocolates had been meticulously hollowed out and refilled with crystalline potassium cyanide. The killer had used a fine-gauge needle to inject the poison through the bottom of each piece, then resealed the chocolate with a drop of warm wax. It was a process that required a steady hand and a deep knowledge of chemistry. The police began checking the purchase records of every major confectionery store in Tokyo, looking for a man who bought high-end chocolate in bulk, but the trail was cold. The investigation hit a wall when they realized the killer wasn't just leaving the boxes in person. Several families reported receiving the poisoned candy through the mail delivered by postal workers who had no idea they were carrying seeds of death. The return addresses were either fake or belonged to abandoned buildings. The killer was playing a game of shadow using the very infrastructure of the city to distribute the poison, making every mailbox in Japan a potential source of terror. The twist came when a forensic linguist analyzed the notes left with the boxes. The handwriting was not just polite, it was archaic, using kanji characters and a formal tone that was common 50 years prior. It suggested the killer was an older individual, someone who felt out of place in the modern neon-soaked Tokyo. They weren't just killing people, they were making a statement against the rapid, soulless progress of the 1970s. The chocolates were a lure, a reminder of a sweetness that no longer existed. You are sitting on a train now, the rhythmic clack of the wheels against the tracks vibrating through your seat. You look across the aisle and see a small festive box sitting on the empty spot next to a sleeping passenger. You remember the warnings, the stories of the burning throats, and the sudden collapses, and you feel a sharp, cold prickle of fear at the base of your spine. You want to look away, but the bright wrapping paper seems to hold your gaze, a beautiful mask for the lethal chemical hidden inside. The climax of the panic reached its peak in February, when the Japanese confectionery industry nearly collapsed. Sales of chocolate dropped by 70%, and major companies were forced to pull all their products from the shelves to prevent further tampering. The killer sent a final letter to the media bragging about how easy it was to poison a city that was too busy to notice its own rot. He promised one final grand gift before vanishing, leaving the police to scramble in a desperate citywide search. The grand gift never arrived. The killer simply stopped evaporating into the gray winter mist as quickly as he had appeared. The reconstruction of the events suggested he was likely a former industrial chemist who had been laid off during the economic shifts of the early 70s. He had operated out of a small rented room, spending his nights carefully preparing the chocolates with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. He didn't want a high body count. he wanted to witness the collapse of public trust. He was a man who understood that in a society built on harmony and politeness, a single act of random, senseless cruelty is more effective than 1,000 threats. He didn't have to break into homes or use a firearm. He just had to leave a box on a bench and wait for someone to act on their own better nature. His ability to remain invisible in the most crowded city on earth was his greatest achievement, a feat that left the Tokyo police with thousands of files but not a single name. As of 2026, the poison candy giver remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of Japanese crime. Modern forensic profiling has recently attempted to link the case to the earlier cyanide cola incidents, suggesting that both were the work of the same individual who was practicing his method before moving to a larger scale. The case is still discussed in Japanese criminology circles as the definitive example of how a faceless killer can use a culture's own virtues to destroy it from the within. The death of public trust is a quiet process, a series of small moments where you decide it is better to be suspicious than to be kind. It starts with a box left on a bench and ends with a city where no one looks each other in the eye. That was Tokyo in 1977. On the other side of the world, in a place where the sun sets over the rolling hills of Tuscany, a different kind of shadow was waiting in the olive groves, watching for couples who thought they were alone. The air in the hills outside of Florence in September of 1974 was soft-smelling of crushed rosemary and sun-baked earth. The only sound was the rhythmic electric chirping of crickets hidden in the silver leaves of the olive trees. A blue Fiat sat parked at the end of a dirt track, its headlights switched off, blending into the indigo shadows cast by the moon. The stillness of the Tuscan night felt like a physical presence, a warm and silent weight that sat over the valley. Stefania Pettini was 18 years old, a girl with a bright, easy smile that seemed to pull people toward her without effort. She lived with her parents in a nearby village, where every Sunday was a ritual of family and shared meals. Stefania worked at a local clothing shop, and she spent her days helping neighbors find the right fabric for a wedding or a christening. She was at that age where the world feels like a map waiting to be unfolded, a series of simple, beautiful milestones lying just ahead. Her boyfriend, Pasquale Gentilcore, was 19 and worked at the local council office. He was a steady, quiet young man who spent his weekends fixing up his father's old car and dreaming of a life beyond the village. They had been dating for enough time that the local shopkeepers already spoke of them in the same breath. To them, the future was predictable and kind, a shared apartment, a wedding in the village church, and a life lived in the same valleys where they had been born. In 1970s Italy, young couples did not have many places to go for privacy. Homes were crowded with multiple generations, and the social rules regarding dating were still rigid and traditional. This gave rise to the lovers' lanes, secluded roads, and olive groves where hundreds of cars would gather under the cover of darkness. It was a common accepted part of the landscape, a temporary sanctuary for young love that everyone knew about but no one discussed. That Saturday night, the air was warm enough that they left the windows slightly cracked to catch the breeze. They had gone to a local dance earlier, the music still ringing in their ears as they drove up into the hills to be alone. Pasquale had parked the car in a spot they had used before, a small clearing surrounded by a stone wall that dated back centuries. They were surrounded by thousands of acres of quiet, undulating hills, feeling entirely isolated from the rest of the world. The change was subtle at first. A shadow moved across the ancient stone wall, but it did not move like a tree branch caught in the wind. It was a heavy, deliberate shift that blocked out the light of the stars for a split second. Then a sharp metallic click echoed through the trees, a sound that did not belong in the natural world. It was the sound of a hammer being pulled back on a heavy piece of machinery, a cold and mechanical note that cut right through the chirping of the crickets. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, hitting the passenger side window with a blinding white glare that turned the interior of the car into a cage of light. Pasquale reached for the ignition, his hand trembling as he fumbled for the keys in the dark. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, uneven beat that seemed to fill the entire cabin of the small car. He did not see a face, only the silhouette of a man standing at the edge of the light, holding a heavy Beretta pistol with a steady, practiced grip. A farmer found the blue Fiat the next morning as he walked his dog along the dirt track. The sun was already high, turning the olive leaves to a brilliant silver. He noticed the passenger window was shattered, the glass glittering on the ground like diamonds in the dust. As he got closer, he saw a trail of wildflowers that seemed to have been placed carefully around the base of the car. He looked through the broken window and immediately backed away his legs, feeling weak and unresponsive as he turned to run for help. The Italian police arrived to find a crime scene that defied everything they knew about local violence. They found several spent shell casings, all of them from rare Winchester Western Series cartridges with an H stamped on the base. The forensic reports showed a level of surgical precision that made the veteran detectives go pale. The female victim had been mutilated post-mortem in a way that required specialized anatomical knowledge and a set of sharp professional blades. For years, the investigation into the monster of Florence was a nightmare of false leads and conspiracy theories. The public began to believe that the murders were part of an occult sect involving the Florentine elite, a group that used human remains in dark rituals. This theory led the police to arrest a local farmer named Pietro Pacciani. The prosecution painted him as a monster, but the evidence was flimsy, and many believed the real killer was someone with a much higher social standing and a much deeper knowledge of medicine. The killer's movements were not those of a panicked amateur. He moved with the cold, rhythmic efficiency of a man who had practiced this sequence 1,000 times in his mind. He worked in the absolute silence of the Tuscan night, ignoring the crickets and the distant sound of the wind. He was a person who viewed the human body not as a life, but as a collection of parts to be catalogued and taken. He did not rush. He did not falter. He simply executed a task with a chilling professional distance. The truth is that the monster of Florence was never truly identified. The investigation resulted in a series of convictions and exonerations that left the families of the victims with no sense of peace. The killer remained a ghost, a presence that haunted the lovers' lanes of Tuscany for over a decade. He was a man who could disappear back into the crowd of a vibrant city, perhaps standing next to you at a cafe or passing you on a narrow street, his secret hidden behind a mask of normalcy. He was someone who likely had access to specialized medical training and high-grade firearms, yet he possessed a psychological void that allowed him to view romantic happiness as something to be surgically dismantled. He treated the hills of Florence as his own private laboratory, a space where he could exercise a dark and meticulous control over the lives of strangers. As of 2026, the case has been reopened following a breakthrough in forensic ballistics. Technicians have reanalyzed a lead-free bullet fragment found in the soil at an old scene using modern isotopic mapping. This has led them to a specific suspect who had ties to a local shooting range and a background in veterinary surgery. The ghost of Tuscany may finally be forced to answer for the silence he left behind in the olive groves. Sometimes the danger does not come from a stranger in a dark olive grove. It comes from the landscape itself, where the silence of the trees hides a different kind of shadow. On the other side of the world, in a place where the sun sets over a dusty South African highway, a different kind of whistle was about to cut through the air. (1976) outside of Durban. The late afternoon sun over the Natal Highway did not sink. It seemed to dissolve into the horizon, turning the air into a shimmering golden haze. A heavy rusted panga was pulled from its sheath in the tall grass, the dry metal making a sharp sliding whistle that cut through the silence. The dirt at the edge of the road was fine as flour rising in small clouds with every breath of the hot, stagnant wind. Thandi was 32 years old, and her legs were strong from years of walking the long stretches between the outlying townships and the city. She worked as a laundress, her days spent over steaming tubs and heavy irons, and her hands were rough and calloused from the labor. She carried a small, colorful bundle of groceries on her head, her posture perfect as she navigated the uneven shoulder of the blacktop, her mind already on the evening meal. The highway stretched out like a long black ribbon, cutting through the dense South African bushveld. To anyone driving by, the landscape looked like a blur of green and brown, but Thandi knew every landmark. She knew the specific cluster of acacia trees where the shade was deepest, and the dry creek bed that signaled she was halfway home. She moved with a rhythmic, steady pace, her leather sandals slapping softly against the warm surface of the road. In the mid-70s, the Natal region was a place of deep, quiet contrasts. The cities were growing, filled with the sounds of construction and industry, but the spaces between them remained wild and indifferent. For the women who lived in the townships, the walk along the highway was a daily necessity, a transition between the world of work and the world of family. It was a time for reflection, a few miles of solitude before the noise of the household took over. Thandi thought about her two children who would be waiting for her at the gate of their small brick house. She thought about the school fees that were due and the way the garden needed watering after the long dry spell. These were the things that weighed on her, the ordinary pressures of a life built on hard work and resilience. She did not look at the bush as a place of danger. To her, it was simply the backdrop to her life, a familiar and unchanging presence. The air was thick with the scent of wild sage and the metallic tang of the dust. Every few minutes, a car or a truck would roar past the wind from its passage, tugging at Thandi's dress and bringing a momentary relief from the heat. She would step further onto the shoulder, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, waiting for the vehicle to disappear into the distance before moving back toward the center. The road was her guide, the one constant in the vast rolling hills. She passed a group of children playing with a homemade wire car in the dirt near a bus stop. They shouted a greeting to her, their voices bright and clear in the late afternoon air. Thandi smiled and waved back a brief moment of connection that made the walk feel shorter. The community was tight-knit, a network of people who looked out for one another in a landscape that could often feel isolating. This was the world she knew, a world built on the strength of shared experiences. As the sun moved lower, the shadows of the trees began to stretch across the highway, turning the green leaves to a deep indigo black. The birds in the bushveld were beginning their evening chorus, a frantic and beautiful symphony of calls and whistles. Thandi adjusted the weight of the bundle on her head, her muscles beginning to ache with a familiar dull fatigue. She was looking forward to the moment she could sit down on her porch and watch the stars come out. The bushveld in 1976 was a place where the edges of the city met the beginning of the wilderness. It was a geography of transition, filled with hidden paths and quiet clearings that only the locals knew. Thandi felt a sense of belonging here, a connection to the soil and the sky that went beyond words. She was a daughter of this land, and she moved through it with a quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of navigating its challenges and its beauty. She reached the halfway point, a spot where the highway dipped into a shallow valley. The air here was slightly cooler, holding the moisture of a hidden spring. Thandi paused for a moment to catch her breath, her chest rising and falling in a steady, even rhythm. She looked up at the sky, which was now a brilliant palette of pink and orange. It was a beautiful evening, the kind that made the long walk feel like a privilege rather than a chore. The first offbeat detail was not a sound but a sudden heavy silence. As Thandi climbed the hill on the other side of the valley, she noticed that the birds had stopped singing. The bush was suddenly unnaturally still. She kept walking, but her pace slowed her ears, straining to catch any sound over the soft thud of her own heart. The air felt charged as if a storm were about to break, though the sky remained clear and the wind had died down to nothing. She saw a movement in the tall grass about 20 yards ahead. It was not the erratic skip of a small animal or the swaying of a branch. It was a slow, deliberate shift of the golden stalks, a heavy weight moving parallel to the road. Thandi stopped. She lowered her bundle from her head, her fingers tightening around the fabric. She felt a sudden sharp prickle of cold at the base of her spine, a sensation that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. The pressure began to rise as she realized the highway was completely empty. No cars were visible in either direction, and the only sound was the rhythmic, distant hum of the city she had left behind. She stood perfectly still, her eyes scanning the edge of the brush. Her breathing became shallow and quick, her lungs feeling as though they were being squeezed by an invisible hand. She did not see a face, but she felt a presence, a focused and predatory intent watching her from the shadows. She decided to move her steps, becoming faster and more erratic as she tried to put distance between herself and the spot in the grass. She did not run, afraid that the sound of her flight would trigger an attack, but she moved with a desperate lunging speed. Her muscles were tense, her shoulders pulled high toward her ears. Every few steps she would glance over her shoulder, her vision blurring, as the adrenaline began to flood her system, making the world seem sharp and distorted. The discovery came when she rounded a bend and saw a pair of boots sitting in the middle of the blacktop. They were old leather work boots covered in the same fine red dust that coated everything in the valley. They were positioned neatly side by side as if someone had just stepped out of them and vanished. Thandi felt a wave of nausea roll through her stomach. She realized then that the silence of the bush was not accidental. It was a space that had been prepared. She backed away from the boots, her sandals scuffing against the pavement. Her heart was now a frantic, uneven roar in her ears, drowning out any other sound. She turned toward the bush, thinking she could find a path to the nearest house, but the thicket looked impenetrable, a wall of thorns and shadows. She was trapped on the narrow strip of the highway, a stage where the lights were slowly being turned out. Her hands were shaking so hard she dropped her groceries. The Durban police had been receiving reports of missing women for months, but in the political unrest of 1976, the disappearances were low on the list of priorities. It wasn't until a local self-defense patrol, armed with spears and walking sticks, found a series of abandoned items along the highway that the scale of the threat became clear. They found handbags, shoes, and colorful head wraps, all tucked neatly into nests hidden deep within the dense roadside brush. The investigation was a slow, agonizing process. The authorities were overwhelmed by the riots in the city, leaving the rural communities to fend for themselves. The local men organized their own watches, moving in groups along the road as the sun set, their eyes fixed on the shadows. They spoke of a man they called the Pangaman, a ghost who moved through the bush without a sound, a predator who used a heavy machete to strike from behind before vanishing back into the green. The twist came when one of the patrol members followed a narrow, crushed path through the grass and found a spot where the earth had been cleared and packed down. In the center of the clearing was a small rusted mirror and a collection of braids and locks of hair, all organized by length and color. This wasn't just a killer, it was a collector. The Pangaman was living in the very landscape he hunted, a man who had turned the nattle bush into his own private gallery. The search for the nests led the police to a series of hideouts that had been hidden in plain sight for years. The killer had been using the natural drainage pipes under the highway and the dense thickets of invasive weeds as a network of tunnels. He could move miles without ever being seen from the road. He was a man who understood the geography of the bush better than the people who had lived there their entire lives. He was part of the land, a dark and violent extension of the silence. The climax of the terror reached its peak in late 1977. A massive community raid was launched after a witness saw a man carrying a heavy curved blade into a thicket near a bridge. Hundreds of men moved shoulder to shoulder through the brush, their voices rising in a rhythmic, ancient chant that was meant to flush the predator out. They found him crouched in a small hand-dug hole under a massive acacia tree, his eyes wide and vacant as the light hit him. He was a man who looked entirely ordinary, a physically fit individual in his late 30s, who could have been any laborer on any farm. He did not fight back. He simply sat in the dirt, his hands resting on his knees, while the rusted panga lay in the grass just a few feet away. The silence that followed his capture was even more haunting than the silence of the bush had been. He looked at the men who had caught him with a terrifying lack of emotion, as if they were the ones who were out of place. The truth revealed during the brief period of his custody was a reconstruction of absolute coldness. He would pick a target days in advance, watching their routine from the safety of his hidden clearings. He knew exactly when the highway would be empty and which women walked alone. He did not use fire or a gun. He used the weight and the momentum of the machete, a tool he had spent his life mastering. He viewed his victims not as people, but as sources for the trophies he kept in his nests. The killer died in his cell just weeks after his arrest before he could be brought to trial. He took the locations of many of his victims to his grave, leaving dozens of families in the Natal region with a mystery that would never be fully solved. The panga was kept in an evidence locker for decades, its blade still holding the microscopic fibers of the floral dresses and head wraps of the women who had been walking home on those hot golden afternoons in the 70s. As of 2026, the bush areas where the Pangaman operated have been cleared and replaced by suburban neighborhoods and shopping centers. The old Natal Highway is now a modern 4-lane road with bright streetlights and constant traffic. But the elders in the community still tell the stories of the Pangaman ghost to warn children about staying on the path. The legend has become a part of the local folklore, a reminder that the silence of the land can hide a very human darkness. The dry, rhythmic crunch of grass underfoot, that was the only warning he ever gave. In the next story, the setting shifts from the wild bush of South Africa to the gated, sun-bleached mansions of Brazil. The danger there didn't come from a man hiding in the grass. It came from the sons of the elite and a crime that would become a national symbol of the fight for the innocent. A small plastic doll with matted synthetic hair lay face down in the red dirt behind a luxury mansion in Vitória. The heat of the 1973 afternoon was a thick, suffocating blanket that smelled of salt water and expensive perfume. Nearby, the leaves of the tropical garden hung heavy and motionless, as if the air itself were too exhausted to move. The only sound was the distant rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic against the sea wall. The doll's dress was a faded blue, stained by the damp earth and the passage of time. It sat just inches away from a cluster of vibrant hibiscus flowers that glowed with an aggressive, almost unnatural brightness under the Brazilian sun. This was a place of high walls and manicured lawns, a sanctuary where the outside world was meant to be kept at a distance. Yet in the silence of the garden, the plastic eyes of the toy seemed to hold a witness to a secret. Araceli was 8 years old, and her life was a simple bright loop of school and home. She was a girl with a quick laugh and a collection of ribbons that she kept organized by color in a small wooden box under her bed. Every morning she would adjust the white collar of her uniform and walk through the sun-bleached streets of her neighborhood. She knew which bakeries smelled of fresh bread and which corners held the coolest shade on the way to her classes. In May of 1973, the city of Vitória felt like a paradise of stability for those who lived behind its gated entrances. Araceli moved through this world with a quiet, trusting grace, her school bag feeling light on her shoulders. She was the kind of child who noticed the small details, the way a lizard froze on a stone wall, or the specific pattern of the clouds over the harbor. To her, the city was a vast playground where the rules were always kind. Her mother Lola spent her afternoons watching the clock, waiting for the specific sound of Araceli's school bag thumping onto the kitchen table. The house was always filled with the scent of cinnamon and the low hum of a radio playing bossa nova. It was a home built on the predictable rhythms of a family that believed they were protected by the sheer normalcy of their routine. They were not wealthy, but they were rich in the certainty of their safety. Lola would often stand by the window looking out at the palm trees that lined the street. She liked the way the afternoon light turned the world into a palette of gold and soft green. She would prepare a small snack for Araceli, a slice of fruit or a piece of cake, and wait for the front door to swing open. In her mind, the walk from the school was a straight, narrow line that her daughter traveled every day without incident, a path paved with the trust of a community. The school was only a few blocks away, a short distance that Araceli had navigated hundreds of times. She liked the feeling of independence that the walk gave her, the way she could stop and look at a shop window or say hello to the neighbor's dog. She was a fixture in the neighborhood, a little girl in a white uniform who was as much a part of the scenery as the colorful houses and the cobblestone paths that wound toward the ocean. Araceli's father worked long hours, his life dedicated to providing the stability his family enjoyed. He was a man of few words, but his affection was visible in the way he meticulously maintained their small garden and the way he always brought home a small treat for Araceli on Friday evenings. The family lived in a world where the biggest concerns were the rising price of coffee or the upcoming school exams. The darker edges of the city were things that happened elsewhere. On that 18th of May, the tropical sun turned the pavement into a shimmering mirror, reflecting the white buildings and the deep indigo of the sky. Araceli's school day ended early, a rare treat that left her with an extra hour of freedom before she was expected home. She stepped out into the bright light, her white socks pulled high and her hair tied back in a neat ponytail. She felt the warmth of the sun on her face and decided to take the long way home. She walked past the small park where the older men played chess in the shade of the banyan trees. The air was thick with the sound of their quiet voices and the click of the wooden pieces against the boards. Araceli watched them for a moment, her curiosity piqued by the serious expressions on their faces. To an 8-year-old, the world of adults was a series of mysterious rituals that she was slowly beginning to understand, a world that felt solid and dependable. Further down the street, she stopped to look at a display of colorful kites in a shop window. They were shaped like birds and butterflies, their long tails tangled together in a vibrant mess of silk and string. Araceli imagined what it would be like to fly one over the beach, to feel the wind tugging at the line as the kite climbed higher and higher into the blue. She stood there for several minutes, her mind lost in a daydream of flight and open spaces. The streets of Vitória were busy with the afternoon rush. Cars honked their horns as they navigated the narrow intersections, and the sidewalks were filled with people heading home from work. Araceli moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who felt entirely at home. She didn't notice the way the luxury cars stood out from the dusty taxis, or the way the high walls of the mansions seemed to watch the street with an indifferent, stony gaze. To her, the city was a collection of friendly faces and familiar landmarks. She knew the man who sold the roasted peanuts from a silver cart and the woman who tended the flower stalls near the church. They would nod to her as she passed, a silent acknowledgement of her place in the neighborhood. This was the foundation of her world, a network of social ties that she believed was unbreakable. She had no reason to doubt that the path home would lead her anywhere else. As she reached the corner that led toward the wealthier district, the atmosphere of the street began to change. The noise of the market faded, replaced by the quiet, heavy stillness of the walled estates. The trees here were taller, their branches arching over the road to create a tunnel of deep, cool shade. Araceli liked this part of the walk. It felt like entering a secret garden where the air was always a few degrees cooler and the world was always silent. She adjusted her backpack and hummed a quiet tune to herself, her footsteps sounding sharp and rhythmic on the clean pavement. She was only 10 minutes from her front door now. She could almost smell the fresh coffee that Lola would be making and hear the sound of the radio. Her plans for the evening were simple: finish her homework, help her mother with the laundry, and perhaps play with her doll in the garden before the sun went down. A witness standing near a bus stop at the edge of the residential district noticed a luxury sedan idling near the curb. It was a car that didn't belong in that specific neighborhood, its polished chrome glinting with an aggressive predatory brightness under the trees. The engine was running a low guttural thrum that vibrated through the air. 3 young men sat inside their faces, partially obscured by the dark tint of the windows and the shifting shadows of the leaves. As Araceli walked past the car, the rear door opened with a heavy metallic click. The witness saw one of the young men lean out and say something to the girl. Araceli stopped, her head tilting to the side in a gesture of polite curiosity. There was a brief, quiet exchange that lasted no more than 30 seconds. The girl looked at the car, then back toward the path to her house. Then, with a hesitant nod, she stepped into the vehicle and the door folded shut. By 6 in the evening, the silence in the apartment was a physical pressure against Lola's chest. The snack she had prepared sat untouched on the table, the fruit beginning to brown in the humid air. She walked to the front door and looked out into the street, expecting to see Araceli rounding the corner at any moment. But the sidewalk was empty, and the golden light of the afternoon was already beginning to fade into a deep bruised purple over the hills. Lola walked the route to the school 3 times that night, her voice growing thin and frantic as she called for her daughter. She stopped every passerby, describing the white uniform and the neat ponytail, but the responses were all the same. No one had seen her. The neighbors joined the search, their flashlights cutting through the dark alleys and the empty parks, but the city of Vitória seemed to have swallowed the 8-year-old girl without leaving a single trace behind. The local police station was quiet when Lola arrived, the officers behind the desk looking at her with a bored professional indifference. They told her that children often wander off in the heat or stay late at a friend's house without telling their parents. They advised her to go home, have a cup of tea, and wait for the morning. Their lack of urgency felt like a cold weight in Lola's stomach, a sensation of being trapped in a system that didn't care about a missing girl. For 6 days, the Karipidis household was a place of suspended animation. The front door was left wide open, a silent invitation for a daughter who did not return. Every phone call was a jolt of electricity that ended in disappointment. Every knock at the door was a shadow that didn't belong to Araceli. Lola could not eat her stomach, feeling as though it were being squeezed by a heavy iron band. She spent her nights sitting on the porch, watching the street and listening for a footstep. The pressure inside the community began to mount as the realization set in that this was not a simple case of a runaway child. In the gated mansions of the Vitória elite, the parties and the social gatherings continued as if the world outside were a different planet. There was a sense of 2 cities living side by side, one that was grieving and one that was protected by a wall of silence and money. Lola felt a sharp, cold dread settling into her bones, a feeling that the truth was being actively suppressed. A groundskeeper working behind a wall of dense hibiscus bushes at one of the luxury estates stopped when he saw a strange gray discoloration in the red soil. He had been clearing the overgrowth for a garden party, his machete moving with a rhythmic mechanical swing. As he moved a heavy branch aside, a pungent chemical odor hit him, a sharp, stinging scent that made his eyes water and his throat constrict with an immediate, violent reflex. He knelt down and began to clear the dirt with his gloved hands, thinking he had found a leaked pipe or a pile of discarded industrial waste. Instead, he found a small pale hand reaching out from the earth. He backed away so quickly he tripped over his own tools, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, uneven beat. The silence of the garden was suddenly shattered by the realization that the red dirt was hiding something that should never have been buried there. The police arrived to find the body of the 8-year-old girl, but she was barely recognizable. The remains had been systematically corroded by a powerful acid, a professional attempt to erase the evidence of the crimes committed against her. Despite the destruction, the forensic team discovered signs of a savage sexual assault that had occurred while the victim was heavily drugged. The brutality of the scene was a direct contradiction to the refined, expensive atmosphere of the surrounding estate. The investigation moved with a sudden, jarring speed that the police could no longer avoid. The trail of evidence led directly to a group of young men known in the city as the Playboys of Vitória. They were the sons of the most powerful families in the state, including the son of a billionaire named Dante Michelini. These were men who lived in a world of luxury cars, expensive drugs, and total legal immunity, viewing the people below them as disposable objects for their own amusement. As the names of the suspects began to circulate, the system that was supposed to provide justice began to protect its own. Witnesses who had seen Araceli getting into the luxury car suddenly suffered from total memory loss or fled the country on short notice. Local officials received phone calls from powerful offices suggesting that the investigation should be handled with extreme discretion. The narrative in the newspapers began to shift, focusing on the reputation of the accused rather than the fate of the girl. Files containing crucial forensic data and witness statements vanished from the courthouse lockers overnight, replaced by empty folders and bureaucratic excuses. The lead detective, a man who had been determined to see the case through, was abruptly reassigned to a remote post in the interior of the country. Every time a new piece of evidence was found, a new obstacle was placed in the way. It was a systematic dismantling of the truth performed with the cold precision of a professional audit. Lola and her family were left to watch as the legal process turned into a farce of technicalities and delays. The suspects were not arrested. They were invited for questioning at their own convenience, arriving in luxury cars with teams of expensive lawyers who spoke of their clients' bright futures and impeccable characters. The contrast between the grieving mother and the smug, detached arrogance of the young men was a sight that burned itself into the memory of the city. The trial finally began in a courtroom filled with the tension of a city divided. The suspects sat in the front row, their suits perfectly tailored, and their expressions one of bored indifference. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like the successful, vibrant future of Brazil. They whispered to their lawyers and checked their gold watches, while Lola sat in the back, her face a mask of exhaustion and grief. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper and the heat of the afternoon. The prosecution's case was hampered by the missing files and the witnesses who had been bribed into silence. Every piece of evidence was challenged, every testimony picked apart by lawyers who were paid more in a day than the Karipidis family earned in a year. The defense argued that the acid had made it impossible to prove a cause of death, and that the presence of the girl at the mansion was merely a coincidence of geography. It was a masterclass in the obfuscation of the obvious. The verdict of acquittal was delivered on a Tuesday morning, the words falling into the silent courtroom like stones into a well. The suspects stood up, adjusted their jackets, and walked out of the building as free men, their luxury sedans waiting at the curb to whisk them back to their gated lives. Outside, a crowd of hundreds had gathered, their voices rising in a roar of disbelief and anger that could be heard all the way to the Atlantic shore. The justice system had officially failed. The truth revealed during the years of subsequent independent investigations was a reconstruction of absolute moral rot. Araceli had been kidnapped as a form of entertainment for a group of men who were bored with their own privilege. They had held her for days using drugs to keep her compliant while they subjected her to horrors that the legal records still struggle to describe. The acid was not just a tool for disposal. It was a final act of narcissism, an attempt to prove they could erase a life entirely. It was a crime that was enabled at every level by a billionaire father who viewed his son's violence as a problem to be solved with a checkbook. Dante Michelini allegedly used his vast political influence to threaten judges and, by the silence of the police, turning the murder of an 8-year-old girl into a logistical challenge for his legal team. The systematic cover-up proved that in 1970s, Vitória, the only thing more powerful than the law was the money that could rewrite it. These were narcissistic predators who viewed the life of a schoolgirl as a currency to be spent on a few hours of drug-fueled cruelty. They possessed a psychological void that allowed them to move from a horrific act of violence back into their high society lives without a single moment of visible remorse. Their primary motive was the exercise of absolute control over the vulnerable, a lethal combination of inherited immunity and a complete lack of empathy for those outside their gated circle. As of 2026, the Araceli case remains a painful, unhealed scar on the history of Brazilian justice. Every year on the 18th of May, the country observes a national day against the sexual exploitation of children, a tribute to the girl in the white uniform who was failed by every institution that was supposed to protect her. Her grave is a place of pilgrimage for those who fight for the vulnerable, a reminder that the truth is often buried but never entirely destroyed. The case has been credited with the creation of modern child protection laws in Brazil, ensuring that the legal system can no longer ignore the disappearance of a child, regardless of the status of the suspects. While the men who took her never served a day in prison, their names are now synonymous with the corruption and the cruelty of an era that the country is still trying to move beyond. Araceli became a symbol of a fight that is far from over, a voice that refuses to be silenced by acid or money. The corruption of wealthy men in a sun-drenched coastal city. That was Brazil in the mid-70s. But in the next case, the darkness moves from the gated mansions of South America to the deep rainforest-shrouded borderlands of West Africa. The threat there didn't come from bored playboys, but from high-ranking government officials who believed that a human life was a currency to be traded for a different kind of ancient power. Night in Harper, 1977. The air was thick and wet, smelling of rain and the sharp salt spray from the Atlantic. Moses Tweh, a man in his late 20s with a voice that everyone in Maryland County recognized, was walking home along the edge of the rainforest. The only sound was the rhythmic, distant thrum of drums coming from deep within the trees, a vibration that seemed to travel through the damp soil and settle in the soles of his feet. The darkness of the borderlands was a deep indigo velvet, broken only by the occasional flicker of a kerosene lamp from a distant porch. Moses adjusted the strap of the guitar case on his shoulder, his fingers tracing the familiar worn leather. The ground was soft beneath his boots, and the high canopy above him whispered with the movement of the night wind. He moved with a steady, practiced ease, his body attuned to the subtle shifts in the landscape he had known since birth. Moses was more than just a resident of Harper. He was its heartbeat. He was a singer whose songs played in the markets and the local bars, capturing the struggles and the pride of the people who lived in this coastal town. He was a man with a wide, easy smile and a way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. In 1977, Maryland County was a place of burgeoning potential, a hub where old traditions met a new modern energy. His daily life was a series of encounters with friends and admirers who treated him like a brother. He would spend his mornings at the waterfront watching the ships come in and talking to the fishermen about the day's catch. The smell of drying fish and diesel fuel was the backdrop to his morning routine. He liked to sit on the weathered wooden pilings, his notebook open on his knee, capturing the rhythmic calls of the workers and the steady crashing of the waves against the shore. By the afternoon, he would be found in his small studio or at a local community center, his guitar always within reach. Moses lived a life that was open and vibrant, a life that belonged to the community as much as it belonged to him. He was a man who believed in the future of his country and the strength of its people. He sang about the beauty of the rainforest and the resilience of the laborers, his voice a soaring, soulful instrument that could quiet a crowded room in seconds. The county was governed by a small elite group of men who lived in large colonial-style houses with manicured lawns. These were the high-ranking officials and businessmen who held the keys to the town's economy and its political future. For a man like Moses, these figures were a distant part of the landscape, the architects of a world he observed through his lyrics. He didn't move in their circles, but he respected the order they maintained and the history they represented. Moses lived in a modest house filled with the things he loved, stacks of records, a collection of local carvings, and the many letters he received from fans across the country. His mother, a woman with a sharp wit and a deep well of stories, was his primary audience. They would spend their evenings on the porch, the air filled with the scent of wood smoke and the sound of his guitar. It was a life of simple pleasures and deep roots, anchored by the love of his family and his art. As the sun began to set over the rainforest, the sky turned a deep bruised purple and the air grew cool and heavy. Moses liked this time of day, the transition between the noise of the town and the quiet mystery of the night. He had a performance scheduled for the following evening at a local festival, and his mind was full of melodies and verses. He walked with a steady, relaxed pace, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, enjoying the solitary walk home after a long rehearsal. He passed a group of young men sitting around a fire near the edge of the woods, their voices low and rhythmic as they shared stories. They waved to him as he passed a brief moment of connection that was typical of life in Harper. The community was small enough that a man like Moses could never truly be a stranger. He felt a sense of belonging that was as thick as the evening mist, a feeling that he was protected by the very people who sang his songs in the streets. He reached the section of the road where the rainforest pressed closer to the path, the trees forming a tunnel of deep, cool shade. This part of the walk always felt like entering a different world, a place where the rules of the town no longer applied. He could hear the calls of the nocturnal animals and the rustle of the leaves as the wind moved through the undergrowth. He felt a deep, quiet respect for the power of the forest, a space that was both beautiful and unforgiving. The pressure of the upcoming festival was a constant but welcome weight on his mind. He wanted his performance to be perfect, a tribute to the people of Maryland County. He spent hours refining his lyrics, searching for the right words to describe the spirit of the town. His commitment to his craft was absolute, a reflection of his belief that music could be a force for good. He was a man who lived with his heart open, a quality that made him both loved and vulnerable. The first sign that something was wrong was not a sound or a struggle, but a sudden localized silence. As Moses reached a bend in the road, he noticed the night birds had stopped their usual calls. The air felt charged, as if a storm were about to break, although the stars were clearly visible through the canopy. He stopped his ears, straining to hear anything over the sound of his own breathing. The rhythmic thrum of the distant drums seemed to have shifted in pitch, becoming a heavy, expectant pulse. A few days later, the waterfront in Harper was missing its most recognizable voice. Moses Tweh had not shown up for his festival performance, an absence that was immediately recognized as an impossibility. His house was found exactly as he had left it, with his guitar sitting on the bed and his latest lyrics scattered on the table. The silence in the small apartment was a physical pressure, a void where there should have been the sound of music and laughter. The rumors began to spread through the market like a fever, moving from stall to stall with a terrifying speed. People spoke in hushed tones about the Boiti rituals, an ancient and terrifying belief that human sacrifice could grant a man absolute political power. The community was gripped by a sudden sharp fear, a sensation of being watched from the shadows. The trust that had defined life in Harper began to fracture, replaced by a restless, paranoid energy. The discovery came a week after his disappearance, when a group of hunters followed a strange, cloying scent into a secluded clearing deep in the forest. They found the remains of the singer, but the scene was not one of random violence. Moses had been operated on with a cold, surgical precision. Certain internal organs had been meticulously removed, and his body had been positioned in a way that suggested a ritualistic ceremony rather than a simple act of murder. The shock of the discovery tore through the social fabric of Liberia. The public outcry was so intense that President William Tolbert himself traveled to Harper to oversee the investigation. He was met with a community that was no longer afraid to speak. Witnesses began to come forward, describing luxury vehicles parked near the forest at midnight and identifying high-ranking officials entering the woods with a group of masked men who carried lanterns and silver bowls. The investigators executed search warrants on the colonial estates of several prominent government officials. In the basements and outbuildings of these houses, they found more than just evidence of the crime. They found the material leftovers of dozens of ritual ceremonies. There were lists of names, strange incense, and expensive silk suits stained with blood. It became clear that the leaders of the county had formed a secret network, using the most vulnerable members of society to fuel their own ambitions. The twist was the sheer scale of the betrayal. This wasn't the work of a few superstitious outliers. It was a systematic operation involving the highest levels of the local government. The very men who were supposed to be building the country's future were instead dismantling its people in the dark. The investigation revealed that they believed the juju from a popular figure like Moses Tweh would be the ultimate offering a sacrifice that would cement their power forever. The climax of the tragedy was a live broadcast trial that gripped the entire nation of Liberia. 7 high-ranking officials, including the superintendent of Maryland County and James Anderson, the son of a powerful politician, were brought before a judge. The evidence was overwhelming, and for the first time in the region's history, the untouchables were found guilty. On a hot, humid morning in 1979, the 7 men were led to a public gallows in Harper and hanged. The truth revealed a chilling reconstruction of the final moments. The officials had used their authority to lure Moses into a vehicle, claiming they wanted to discuss a government-sponsored tour. Once inside, he was drugged and taken to the forest clearing. They didn't view him as a singer or a person. They viewed him as a logistical component in a chemical equation meant to produce the magic of permanent authority. They treated a human life as a currency to be spent on their own greed. James Anderson was a man who moved with the confidence of someone who believed he owned the very air he breathed. He was highly educated and well-spoken, representing the modern face of Liberian politics. Yet he held a psychological void that allowed him to pivot from a cabinet meeting to a ritual murder without a single moment of internal conflict. His primary motive was the acquisition of absolute power, a goal he pursued with the detached, analytical precision of a professional auditor. As of 2026, the case is still cited as a milestone for justice in West Africa, a moment when the law proved it could reach even the most powerful. The clearing in the forest has been reclaimed by the jungle, but the grave of Moses Tweh remains a site of quiet remembrance. His songs are still played in the markets of Harper, a reminder that the voice of the people can never be truly silenced by the darkness of those who seek to control them. The distant rhythmic beat of ritual drums in the deep forest eventually faded into a different kind of sound. It was replaced by a more mechanical note, the steady, vibrating roar of heavy machinery drowning out the silence of a midnight factory in Tel Aviv. In the final case, the darkness moves from the rituals of power to the cold industrial logic of the underworld, where a machine was used to make 2 men vanish forever. Three in the morning in South Tel Aviv is a time when the city finally seems to hold its breath. The humid air off the Mediterranean hangs heavy over the industrial zones, smelling of salt and damp concrete. Inside a large, nondescript food processing plant, the fluorescent lights hummed with a low electric buzz that felt like it was vibrating inside your skull. Everything was stainless steel and white porcelain. In the center of the room, a massive industrial meat grinder sat dormant, its mouth a dark, yawning circle. Amos Unger was 40 years old, and he was a man who understood the specific, unwritten geography of the Tel Aviv underworld. He was a smuggler by trade, a man who could look at a cargo ship and see a dozen different ways to move a pallet without a single signature. He lived in a comfortable apartment where the morning air was filled with the scent of strong coffee and the sound of the radio. He was a man of habit, a person who valued the predictable nature of his business dealings above all else. His partner, Ezer Cohen, was the quiet anchor to Amos's more vibrant energy. Ezer was a man of few words and thick, calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. He was the one who watched the shadows and checked the locks, his eyes always moving with a slow, deliberate caution. Together they were a fixture in the local cafes, where they would spend their mornings drinking espresso and discussing the shifting currents of the port. They were men who felt they had earned their place in the city. In 1977, Tel Aviv was a city caught in the middle of a massive expansion, a place where the old world of the markets was slowly being overshadowed by high-rise buildings and modern industry. There was a sense of opportunity in the air, but also a sense of danger. The underworld was reorganizing, and the codes of silence were being tested by a new generation of criminals who didn't follow the old rules. Amos and Ezer moved through this world with a swagger that came from decades of survival. Amos spent his afternoons walking along the waterfront, his leather jacket open and his hands in his pockets. He liked the smell of the diesel fuel and the way the sun turned the ocean into a sheet of hammered silver. He was a man who loved the city, its noise, and its hidden corners. He had a family who relied on him, a wife who made the best hummus in the neighborhood, and 2 children who were the pride of his life. He worked hard to ensure they were shielded from the darker edges of his profession. Ezer lived alone in a small, tidy flat near the market. His life was organized around the gym and the docks. a routine that provided him with a sense of purpose and a way to manage the restless energy that had always defined him. He was a man who valued loyalty above everything else, and his bond with Amos was the most important relationship in his life. They had survived countless close calls and shifting alliances, and they believed their partnership was the one constant in an unpredictable world. They were currently involved in a complex deal involving high-end electronics, a project that required a high level of coordination and a lot of late-night meetings. The pressure of the deal was beginning to show in the way Amos checked his watch and the way Azer's eyes lingered on the street corners. They knew they were being watched by the larger syndicates, but they also knew they held a position of value. They were the bridge between the suppliers and the market, and they believed that made them indispensable. The industrial zone where the factory was located was a maze of gray warehouses and narrow alleys that seemed to swallow the light. During the day, it was a hive of activity, but at night it turned into a ghost town. Amos and Ezer were used to this landscape. It was where their best work was done. They didn't fear the silence, they used it. They moved through the streets with a quiet confidence, their footsteps sounding sharp and rhythmic against the pavement as they headed toward their latest meeting. Their contact for this project was a man who owned several processing plants in the area, a businessman with a reputation for being both efficient and ruthless. He was a man who understood the logistics of the city as well as they did. The meeting was scheduled for midnight, a time when the factory would be empty, and the noise of the machinery would provide a perfect cover for their conversation. Amos and Ezer arrived exactly on time, their car engine purring in the cool night air. The factory interior was a cavernous space filled with the scent of raw meat and cleaning chemicals. The silver machinery stood like silent sentinels under the dim security lights. Amos led the way, his boots clacking on the polished concrete, while Ezer followed a few steps behind his hand, resting near his waistband. They moved toward the back office, expecting a standard negotiation. They had no reason to suspect that the rules of the game had changed while they were drinking their morning coffee. The first offbeat detail was the car. A young woman living in an apartment overlooking the industrial gate noticed the blue sedan parked near the factory entrance at 3 a.m. She thought it was unusual because the engine was still running its low hum, vibrating through the glass of her window. She watched for a few minutes, expecting to see someone return, but the vehicle remained empty, its headlights casting long pale beams across the empty road before the engine finally sputtered and died. By the following afternoon, the silence in the neighborhood had turned into a thick, suffocating pressure. Amos and Ezer had not arrived at their usual cafe, and their associates began to feel a sharp, cold dread settling into their bones. Phone calls to their homes were met with the confused voices of their families, who had been waiting for them to return since dawn. The underworld went quiet, a collective breath being held as the realization set in that the two most reliable men in the city had vanished. A group of local smugglers, worried about their own interests, decided to check the factory where the meeting was supposed to have taken place. They found the blue sedan exactly where the neighbor had seen it, the doors unlocked and the keys still in the ignition. Inside the car, Amos's favorite lighter sat on the dashboard next to a pack of cigarettes. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, and no blood. It was as if the two men had simply evaporated into the humid Tel Aviv air. The police were called in only after the families realized the underworld wasn't going to provide any answers. The investigators arrived at the factory to find a building that was meticulously clean. The floors had been recently scrubbed, and the air carried the sharp, stinging scent of industrial-grade bleach. The owner, Tuvia Oshri, met them at the door with a polite, bored expression. He claimed the meeting had been canceled and that he hadn't seen Amos or Ezer in over a week. The lead investigator, a man who had spent 20 years navigating the lies of the city, didn't believe a word of it. He walked through the processing floor, his eyes scanning the machinery for anything that looked out of place. He noticed that the large industrial meat grinder in the center of the room looked as if it had been disassembled and cleaned with a level of detail that was unusual for a Tuesday morning. He felt a sudden cold prickle of unease on the back of his neck. He ordered a full forensic sweep of the facility, a process that took several days. The technicians moved through the room with specialized lights and chemical sprays, looking for microscopic traces of biological material. They focused on the floor drains and the deep recesses of the grinding mechanism. In a narrow gap between two stainless steel plates, they found a single dark hair. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. They bagged the evidence and sent it to the lab with a sense of grim determination. The investigation hit a wall when the forensic reports came back inconclusive regarding the hair. DNA was not yet a tool they could rely on. However, they found another detail that was much harder to explain. The factory's water meter showed an enormous spike in usage between the hours of 2 and 5 on the night the men disappeared. Thousands of gallons of water had been used to flush the drains, a volume that far exceeded what was needed for a standard cleaning of the floor. The pressure on Tuvia Oshri began to mount as the police started questioning his employees. Most of them were terrified, their eyes darting to the floor whenever his name was mentioned. But eventually one young worker broke. He described a night where the factory lights stayed on long after shift and the roar of the heavy grinders could be heard echoing through the empty streets. He spoke of Oshri and his accomplice Herzl Avitan standing over the machines with a cold, focused intensity. The worker's testimony revealed a level of brutality that the city had never seen before. He described how the two victims were lured into the office, shot quickly, and then moved to the processing floor. There was no emotion, no anger. It was a logistical task performed with the efficiency of a factory line. The killers had spent hours dismantling the bodies and running them through the industrial grinders, turning 2 human lives into a stream of unrecognizable material that was then flushed away. The most chilling part of the story was the meal. The witness claimed that after the machines were finally switched off and the floor was hosed down, Oshri and Avitan didn't flee. They didn't show signs of panic or remorse. They sat down in the small factory office, opened a bottle of wine, and ate a full meal of steak and bread. They sat there in the silence of the early morning, talking about their plans for the future, while the scent of bleach and copper still hung in the air. The hunt for the godfathers of the Tel Aviv underworld went international. Oshri and Avitan used their connections to secure fake passports and fled to Europe, moving through the shadows of the continent for years. It took a massive coordinated effort between Israeli authorities and international police to track them down. They were finally located in a quiet suburb of Rome, living under assumed names and continuing their criminal activities as if they had never left the industrial zones of Israel. The extradition was a sensation, a moment that gripped the entire nation. The 2 men were brought back to Tel Aviv under heavy guard, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses as they were led into the courthouse. The public, now fully aware of the Mincer murders, gathered in the hundreds to see the men who had turned a food processing plant into a site of industrial execution. The trial was a slow, agonizing revelation of the coldness that can exist within the criminal mind. Tuvia Oshri sat in the courtroom with a detached, almost bored expression. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a successful businessman who had simply solved a difficult problem. He viewed the murders as a necessary transaction, a way to settle a debt and send a message to the rest of the underworld. He didn't see Amos and Ezer as people. He saw them as obstacles that needed to be processed and removed. His lack of empathy was his greatest shield. His accomplice Herzl Avitan was a different kind of threat. He was a man with a history of violent escapes and a complete disregard for the law. During the trial, he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the witnesses with a predatory intensity that made even the investigators uncomfortable. He was the muscle to Oshri's mind, a man who viewed violence as a tool to be used without hesitation. Together, they represented the definitive end of the age of innocence for the city's crime. The reconstruction of the final moments was a masterclass in forensic persistence. The police were able to show that the killers had utilized the high-pressure cleaning systems of the factory to erase almost every trace of their work. They had understood the chemistry of the space and the mechanical functions of the grinders perfectly. They hadn't just committed a murder, they had performed an industrial audit on 2 human lives, ensuring that there was nothing left for a family to bury. The truth was that Amos and Ezer were gone long before the sun came up on that Wednesday morning. They had been reduced to a collection of data points and logistics, their existences wiped out by a machine that didn't know the difference between livestock and life. The industrial silence of the factory was a testament to the absolute coldness of the act. The killers had relied on the noise of the city and the indifference of the machines to hide a crime that should have been impossible. Tuvia Oshri and Herzl Avitan were convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but the closure for the families was a hollow victory. There were no remains to return to the earth, no place to go to say a final goodbye. The memory of the 2 smugglers became a part of the city's dark folklore, a story told in whispers in the cafes where they used to sit. The industrial zone remained a landscape of concrete and steel, that held the secret of those 3 hours in the dark. As of 2026, the site where the factory once stood has been leveled and replaced by a modern urban development of high-tech offices and glass-walled cafes. The industrial silence of the 1970s has been replaced by the hum of servers and the quiet chatter of professionals. However, the case is still studied in Israeli police academies as a definitive example of the shift toward a more brutal, mechanical era of organized crime. It serves as a reminder of how easily a person can be erased. The air in your room probably feels a little different now than it did an hour ago. That is the thing about these stories. They do not just end when the narration stops. They tend to linger in the corners of the space, resting in the shadows behind the door or in the silence of the hallway. When we talk about the mid-1970s, we often focus on the colors, the music, or the politics, but the real legacy of that decade is found in the quiet moments that went wrong. It is found in the way a game of hide-and-seek or a bus ride home could suddenly lose its anchor to the world we think we know. What remains in the mind after hearing about Helen or Kerstin is not the act itself, but the persistence of the ordinary. We are left thinking about that melting ice cream cone on the sidewalk or the single white school shoe left on a fire escape. These are not just pieces of evidence. They are the last physical echoes of a life that was moving forward with total confidence. The horror does not come from the unknown. It comes from the realization that the things we find most comforting, the sound of a school bell or the sight of a colorful kite, can also be the last things a person sees. We are forced to ask questions that do not have easy answers. How do you look at a public park the same way after knowing a child can vanish in 45 seconds? How do you trust the lock on a door when you know a building can have its own mechanical secrets that only a predator understands? Fear we feel tonight is not about monsters in the woods. It is about the person who knows the bus route, the man who lives in the apartment next door, or the official who smiles while he shakes your hand. It is the fear of the person who blends perfectly into the background. The psychological residue of these cases is a heavy, quiet weight. It changes the way we perceive physical space. A canal is no longer just a drainage system. It is a place where a name can be erased with acid and a rice sack. A lover's lane is no longer a sanctuary for romance. It is a laboratory for a surgeon who hunts in the dark. We start to scan the edges of the brush when we walk along a highway, listening for the birds to go silent. We realize that the landscape itself is a witness holding on to the sounds of the night long after the people involved are gone. There is a specific kind of haunting that comes from the updates of 2026. Seeing the advancement of DNA and 3D mapping brings a sense of justice, but it also highlights the decades of silence that preceded it. It reminds us that for 20 or 30 years, these killers walked the same streets we do. They bought groceries, they sat on park benches, and they watched the news of their own crimes while the rest of the world looked the other way. The truth finally arriving is a relief, but the weight of the years spent in the dark is something that never truly lifts. We listen to these stories at 2 a.m. because the night makes the world feel smaller and more honest. In the daylight, we can ignore the blind spots and the whispers, but in the silence of a rainy evening, we are forced to acknowledge the fragility of the social contract. We are the night crew, the ones who stay awake to keep a vigil for the names that were almost forgotten. We are the ones who understand that the most important detail is often the smallest one, the way a latch clicks, or the way the crickets stop their song right before the shadow moves. The lesson of the 1970s is that safety is a fragile agreement we make with the world. Most of the time that agreement holds. But when it breaks, it does not break with a roar. It breaks with a whisper, a car door closing quietly, or a gift left on a bench. The real terror is in the banality of the predator's life, the way they can eat a meal in an office while the machines are still cooling down. It is the realization that a human mind can be a place of absolute industrial coldness, hidden behind a mask of everyday routine and professional duty. As you prepare to sleep, take a moment to appreciate the stillness of your home. The locks are secure, the windows are shut, and the world outside is resting under the rain. The stories we shared tonight are ghosts, and you are the one who gave them a place to be heard. You are safe in your space, anchored by the reality of the present. But let the memory of these details keep you sharp. Let the stories remind you to watch the shadows, to listen to the birds, and to never take the ordinary for granted. The world is a beautiful place, but it has a long, deep memory. Check your locks one last time. Make sure the stove is off and the heater is set. I will be here in the next one, waiting with more stories from the dark corners of history. If you have a story of your own, or if one of these cases touched someone you know, feel free to share it in the comments. I read every single one of them before the sun comes up. Stay safe, stay observant, and remember that the night crew always looks out for its own. Sleep well, and I will see you when the shadows start to stretch again. Good night.